And Elizabeth Howell, thank you so much for joining me. I know we connected a couple weeks ago, and I've been looking forward to the conversation. But first off, how are you?
I'm doing great. I live in Canada. It's a little bit warm up here. I know that you Southerners, probably will laugh, but we're not used to 90, 95 degrees in September in my parts in Ottawa, Canada. So we're a little sweltering, but we're getting there.
Did you grow up in Canada?
Yes, I did actually. I grew up on the other side of the city to where I now live, but still within great reach of my family and all the friends that I knew too when I was growing up. So I'm super lucky.
Very cool. And it's space has been a topic that I've always kind of I think known more about just because my uncle, I told you he worked for NASA and he works on the Artemis programs now. But I never really dove into it and really understood it. And it was always kind of looked at to me as this like grand, big idea in a way. And in the last few years, though, I've gotten more interested in it. And that's why I was excited to reach out to you and excited that you accepted the offer to come on. And I'm interested how you first got interested in space.
Well, you can't see it here, but sitting in front of me is the biggest, most ginormous poster of Apollo 13, the movie. So, as some of you may remember, back in the 1990s, there was this very kind of heart pumping recreation of what happened when this mission went around the moon, and they had a huge issue on the way. So, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, they were fine, but I saw it on my last day of school or second last day of school when I was, I think, in seventh grade. And something just struck me. I grew up in an aviation family, but I never had really thought about space like you until I saw it made concrete. A bunch of people were coming together in this Hollywood film to solve a big problem. And I thought, that's really cool. So luckily it was summer. And luckily also there was a library close to me. So I just walked down the road and I got the book that was based on the movie that was written by Jim Lovell, the astronaut, and Jeffrey Kluger, the journalist, really nice guys. And I started reading and I kept reading and reading and reading. And I think that's all I did basically for the next 10 years. I probably went to school and had friends in there as well. But I was a little obsessed, I have to say. And it taught me a lot of good things, about teamwork, about solving problems, about trying to figure a way through things. And then many, many adventures later, it's been about 3 decades, I suppose. I finally have landed in a full-time job where I get to talk about it all the time. But I certainly had some fun adventures along the way.
Do you remember, and it could be Apollo 13, which is a great movie, Tom Hanks, shout out to him. And do you remember like the first time you were researching or studying something within space or within space research that you're like, oh my goodness, I love this?
It was the movie, I think, because there's that scene where they're all getting together and they're trying to solve this problem where there's too much carbon dioxide building up inside the spacecraft. And so the people out in space were experiencing this, but they didn't have the time to figure out how to build the stuff. And so down on Earth, they had this really nice scene where they were saying, okay, you got to build, everything that you need just using these materials. And then they dump them all out on the table and everybody goes to work and they come up with a solution, which is basically what happened in real life. It's somewhat simplified, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
that's what happened. And as I was progressing through school, people were telling me that I was a really strong writer, which was really nice to hear. Obviously, I had a lot of practice because I started writing when I was 2. That was another thing that I was doing all the time. Just whenever I had something interesting to think about, I would write it down. And so I had a lot of practice. And as I was trying to think about where to go for a career, my parents actually very kindly were saying that scene really struck them because they knew that I was a person who could kind of take the puzzle pieces like they were doing in that movie and then put them together into something interesting. And so they said, you really like writing and you really like space, why don't you try and go in that direction somehow? And so I happen to be in Ottawa, as I said. We have a really good journalism school called Carleton University. Went there for 4 years, and every chance that I had, I wrote about space. And then I went into the career. 2007, 2008 was when I started a pretty hard time to start a career for many people, I have to say. So I kept jumping where I needed to, and I kept trying my best to keep writing about space and learning about space. And I do have to admit there was a lot of privilege along the way, obviously, because I had great parents. I had this really strong foundation. I got to stay within my home city my entire life, but I still was learning, and trying to make the best of all the circumstances. And so whenever I needed a bit of inspiration, I just would fire up that movie and watch it again and go, things aren't so bad, I'll figure it out. And
Definitely.
yeah, so yeah, I think it was that one scene that really kind of struck me and made me think creatively about how to do a career, because it wasn't laid out. It wasn't like I joined a newspaper and got to stay there
Mhm.
for 20 years. I had to keep rebuilding and rethinking and making my way.
Yeah, and what kind of led me to you was the James Webb Telescope and how they were finding out new things about the universe, right? That we maybe hadn't seen before or known before. So the first kind of thing I want to dive in is the James Webb Telescope. Can you kind of just describe what is the purpose of it or why it was created?
Oh, totally. So I'm from what's called the Hubble generation, so I'm getting kind of old, I suppose, but that's the Hubble telescope, right? And so when I was growing up, I guess it was subconscious, but you'd open up books and you would see pictures that were made by the Hubble Space Telescope. And then they're also measuring things. Like they saw that the universe was going faster as it got bigger, which is really weird. And it took Hubble and a bunch of other telescopes to confirm that they weren't, seeing strange things. It actually was
Hmm.
happening. Physics is very counterintuitive. Anyway, Hubble's older now. It's been up in space for more than 30 years. And the challenge is we are keeping it going. It's been repaired. There might be another mission to do that sometime in the future too, but you want to go further, right? You want to keep building on that. So the challenge with Hubble is, if this is the Earth, Hubble's right here, right? It's right next to Earth. And so you can't see around Earth, and the
Hmm.
Earth reflects light, which is really bad for telescopes, right? Because if there's light, they can't see out in the universe. And so the idea with Webb was, or JWST as some folks call it, is if here's Earth, let's just keep on going and going and going. This is Webb kind of going away from Earth. You can't see my other fist, but it's going far, far, far away. So it's about 1 million miles away from Earth.
And
So
how
there's
far is the Hubble?
yeah. So Hubble's just nestled up. It's kind of at about 500, 600 kilometers, so I guess about 400 miles. And then you got Webb that's out at 1 million miles.
Wow.
So that's quite a difference, right? And it has a really big mirror. It unfolds like a honeycomb. And that means that it can collect more light, which means it can see deeper into the universe, all the way to the early galaxies. And it's doing a tremendous job out there. So, what it's trying to do is to uncover more about how our universe began. And then it also can swing around and look at all kinds of interesting things, right? It can look at planets. Hubble wasn't built to look at planets, by the way. It does that, but it wasn't built to look at exoplanets far outside the solar system. It only was optimized for Jupiter and Saturn and all those ones that were close by. But Webb is. And so Webb can actually look at a bunch of planets and tell us more about how solar systems were formed, just like ours, right?
Hmm.
It can even look at our own planets, Neptune, Uranus, all those, to see what the weather is like, if it's changing, if there's anything we don't anticipate. So it's doing a great job. I'm
Yeah.
really
Can
excited
you
about it. Yeah.
can you talk to me about some things we've learned from the James Webb Telescope?
The challenge is it's such a new mission. It's
Hmm.
only been out there for about 2 years. And so I can tell you about some of the studies that we've done and some of the places that we've looked at, but in terms of sort of its impact, I can't even predict that yet because it's still in its infancy. It's going to be kind of working for another 20 years. And so I think the best way to stay up to date, if I can just put in one flag for where I work, is I work for a great place called
Hmm.
space.com. Whenever there's a picture, which is like every week, if not more, we put it up there and you can see the huge number of targets that it's starting to look at, it's starting to get data on. So it's got galaxies, it's got planets, it's trying to be looking at far out into the universe to look at the first galaxies as they were being born, as they were being put together. And then with every one of those pictures, you got to understand that there's also a background of science and data and papers that are being published. And it's this stuff that really drives the engine to keep Webb going, because the more research that it produces, the more people are going to want to use it, and the longer its funding will hopefully persist. So it's cool.
One of the hardest things I think for people to understand is somehow we're looking back in time, right?
Exactly. We're looking right back to the beginning of
How
the
does
universe.
that work?
Well, I'm not a physicist, so I may get it somewhat wrong, but essentially what we're doing is we're having a telescope with a mirror that's so big that it can collect a lot of light. And if you can collect a lot of light and you can focus in the right spot, then you can see photons or particles, if I may put it, of light that were starting billions of years ago. That's with a B, billions of years ago. And so because of its light collection ability, it can look just extraordinarily far back and see the stuff as it originates, which is, I agree, mind-blowing. You know, it's hard for me to think about too, and I do this all the time.
Didn't we recently learn that the universe might be as twice as old as we once thought?
That was a study that was published, and then there were quite a few folks, astrophysicists, that were coming out and had some issues with the study. It's rather complicated, but it just has to do with the way that they were measuring the rate of expansion. So as I said, the universe is getting bigger, and they had some quibbles with the way that that was being calculated in that paper. So I'd urge you to go and read the stories. It's a lot for me to kind of get out of the top of my head. I prefer to have like the research in front of me, but yeah, I would not take that as the last word at this time. That's for sure.
Got it. All right, I heard that, and then that was another thing that just kind of blew my mind. With
Yeah,
yeah, totally. It's hard to wrap your head around it.
exactly.
With your career, I mean, you've experienced a lot, and you've been able to, go to many space launches, and you've done a deep dive into the Artemis program, and that's another program that I think is fascinating. Can you just speak to the overall, I guess, mission or goal of the Artemis program? And I know there's many Artemis missions, but
Oh,
the
totally.
overall goal.
And it's dizzying, and we're still just at the beginning, so it may change. But Apollo 13 was that last big moon program with humans, right? Where they were landing people on the moon. 12 folks landed on the moon. They were basically all the same kind of person. Most of them were test pilots. All of them were men. All of them came from very similar backgrounds in the United States. And so they did a great job. Please don't discount that, because it's an incredible program, still inspires me to this day. But we've changed a little bit as a society since the 1960s and the 1970s. There are more kinds of people that want to do this, and I think that's a great thing. The more perspectives we have, I think that spaceflight is safer, actually, when we have lots of people in the room with lots of different ideas and lots of different experiences. So the hope is we're going to be able to go back. We're going to be able to use the resources on the moon, because there's water. We didn't know there was water back in the 60s and 70s. Now we know, because we've had new missions find it. So we use the water, we use the rocks, we use anything else we can to build up a settlement, and then it's more sustainable to stay. Then you don't have to ship everything all the way from Earth. So then it turns into a series like For All Mankind, for example, that Apple TV series, kind of like that idea, right? Where you're building stuff. It's going to be slow, though. So this is the way it's going to go. We had one mission already. It went around the moon with 3 mannequins, really cute. And there was Shaun the Sheep and some Lego and a bunch of other stuff and satellites. And it was called Artemis 1. It did really, really well, but there were no people. So we got to test it with people. Before landing on the moon, it's probably more prudent to go around the moon, because that's the, safer thing to do. So the next mission is called Artemis 2. And that's going to launch no sooner than the end of 2024. It could change if there's some technical things that need to work out, but they do have a crew. It's 3 NASA astronauts and a Canadian. I'm Canadian, so I'm a little excited, as you might imagine. Then, after that all finishes, assuming that things go on time, it's the next one that's going to land. So that one's called Artemis 3. It's going to land on the moon in 2025 or 2026. Again, that may change. There are some spaceships to build. SpaceX needs to launch and certify its Starship system. There's a lot of activity as we're speaking right now about Starship, and kind of questions about when that's going to go, but some folks are hoping sooner. So we'll see how that happens. And then once that lands, then that kind of opens it up for more missions to go in the future. So we'll probably see once every couple of years through the rest of the 2020s and into the 2030s, but that's assuming that we still have the funding and the will. And what's interesting is that every one of these missions is going to have a different type of person on it. So the Artemis 2, for example, it's got the first woman to leave low Earth orbit. It's got the first person of color, and of course, the first non-American, the Canadian that I mentioned. So already we're starting to see it. And I can't wait to see who's selected next for Artemis 3. That's going to be the big one, I think.
So for me to kind of wrap my head around it, though, is it for, and what I've read is to create a settlement on the moon.
Yep.
To potentially one day go to Mars?
It could. It very well could. So here's a good way of thinking about it. Say you're going up Everest, which is a whole thing on its own, right? So only a few people get to go all the way to Everest. but it's really good to have a base camp to supply them, right?
Hmm.
Because they need a safe spot to go back and forth to pick up equipment. There's also a spot for folks to, go out and help them if they need that. Think of the moon like that, because the moon is only 3 days from Earth. Mars is something like 6 months, 9 months, at least with current systems. That might change, but for now, it's 6 months, 9 months. And so, if we have folks that are on the moon practicing the routines, practicing how to be mining, practicing how to be living, practicing how to work in close quarters. I mean, anybody who's been in a car or even a bus for any period of time knows how hard it is to work with your neighbor after a while, right? So you got to work that stuff out on the road, right? And hopefully train for it beforehand. So the more that we can practice close to home, the easier it's going to be to go all the way out to Mars and do it out there when you
Hmm.
can't just turn around. Watch The Martian if you want a good movie about how you can't turn around and what
Yeah, it's
happens
good.
next.
Matt Damon.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
with so we've learned, like you said, a lot more about the moon than we knew, years ago. Do we know if we can create, like, can we drink the water there? Can we figure out a way to make growth and make plants, that sort of thing?
So, two parts I'll split that question into for my answer. So, the first thing is we're practicing on Earth. So, one thing about the moon is it's a super remote environment, to put it very simply, right? So, all those skills that we've learned camping, or all those skills that we've learned living in really remote places, like in Canada, I immediately think of the far north because that's tough, right? It's
Yeah.
really cool and dark for part of the year. The communities often it's like fly in or fly out, or maybe a snowmobile in the winter, right? So it's really, really expensive and difficult to get stuff back and forth. So we can take those skills and we can pivot them over to the moon, first of all. And then the second part I would say is we found water, but the trouble is we've seen the water from a satellite, right? So here's the moon, here's the satellite, and it's up here. You can only see so much from up here. I realize that we got supervision now, high definition, but you're not going to really know until you go to the ground and start shoveling, so to speak. So NASA has humans that it plans to bring there, and it also has a set of robots that it's going to be putting down there. And so those robots are like rovers and landers and all sorts of little machines that are going to be exploring and seeing exactly how much water there is and to start to map it. Then, of course, there's a question of getting it out. And then, as you say, whether it's safe to drink. So it's not going to happen in a minute. Clearly it's going to take a few years, just like any excavation, but I think it's going to be fun to watch to see what
Yeah.
happens, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, it's crazy. Like, and we always, I mean, I've always thought like, oh, a man going to Mars, that's like the next thing. And like, this is the program that is designed eventually maybe to get a human on Mars. Is there,
Exactly.
you mentioned SpaceX. What is the Starship program?
So, Starship is going to be what Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX, what he wants to do is eventually, he probably would want it tomorrow, but I don't know exactly when, but he wants to send people to Mars. Now, that's the goal. How long it's going to take to get there is a question. The joke in the community is Mars is always 20 years away. So you talked to me in 1960, I would have said, oh, yeah, we're going to have settlements all over the place in the 80s, right? And clearly, so before I make a prediction and sound silly, that's kind of my background. However, the idea is this is going to be a big lift rocket, and it's going to send a lot of material out to the moon and out to Mars because once you got people there, they need things, right? I'm not
Hmm.
just talking about, little models and things, but we need food, we need structures, we need medical supplies, we need all this stuff just to stay safe. Engineering supplies, keeping the habitats warm enough, oxygen, all this stuff has to be shipped out there until we can figure out how to make it on site. So this is like a heavy lift truck that can do this. But the challenge is right now, it hasn't yet, as we've recorded, left Earth and gone into space. He did do a launch in April that did not finish as planned. And there's going to be an investigation that's completing by the Federal Aviation Administration to figure out what's next. But meanwhile, they've obviously been doing all this testing and
Hmm.
getting the rocket ready. And so we're at an interesting moment, I think, where nobody really knows what's going to happen next. I mean, clearly, eventually, we're hoping for a launch,
Yeah,
but
sure.
exactly, but how soon and what's going to happen is kind of what makes it fun to think about, right? Because
Yep.
if it goes well, then maybe we can get those Artemis astronauts on the surface sooner, for example. So I can't wait to see.
So for the Starship, it's a carrier
It's
for.
a big It'd be better if I had a picture in front of me. Maybe you can pull one up for the show notes. But
All right.
essentially, you can picture like a really, really big space shuttle looking vehicle. That's what it
Hmm.
is. A nice big silver vehicle that has a huge cargo hold that can hold this stuff. And supporting it is a big rocket that's called Super Heavy. And when you stack the Starship and the Super Heavy together, it's the tallest rocket in the world. So that's
Wow.
how big this thing is. It's just massive. And apparently, those who were lucky enough to watch that launch in April saw quite a show because it makes, if you ever get to see any rocket launch, you'll know that you're watching and you see the thing go up, but the speed of sound is slower than the speed of light. So you see it go, but you don't actually feel the vibrations until several seconds after. And so from what I understand, the vibrations were quite intense. You could see and feel quite a bit after that thing went up.
What are some of your most memorial or things you remember most about some of the launches you've been to?
I've been lucky enough to be to six, and I'm just trying to think about all of them in sequence because there's been a lot of fun ones. I went to three space shuttle launches, and then I went to the ones in Russia before everything started to change out there.
Hmm.
I think actually I might go with my last human mission out in Russia. That was out in 2018. So what was interesting was they have a system called Soyuz. It's super reliable. It's been running for about 30, 40, maybe even 50 years now, quite a long time, many, many decades anyway. And unusually, there was a Soyuz spacecraft with two people on board. It launched and there was a problem with the rocket, a very, very simple one as it turned out, but it was enough to cause an issue. And just as designed, the spacecraft left and it parachuted back to Earth. And the guys were okay. They even went for lunch afterwards with the director of the Russian space program. So clearly, they might have been a bit shaken up, but they were healthy enough to eat. They were medically assessed, all was well, and they went back into space a few months later. But what was interesting was that was the last launch before I went. So you can imagine how I woke up on launch morning. I'm out in Kazakhstan. The launching pad is in Kazakhstan under Russian territory. And I woke up before dawn and I just was thinking, I sure hope they fixed it. And I mean, I knew that they had tested it. I knew that they had run missions up into space, but there's always a part of your mind, right? So I'm going, I hope that they got it right, because my Canadian's going to be on board. And then it was freezing. It was minus 40 almost, both Fahrenheit and Celsius. And so we're all bundled up and we're heading out to the launch pad. And what's fun is that the viewing area is actually a little bit closer because the rocket's a bit smaller, so there's not as much risk. And so we got to go up close and just stand there in the cold and we're like chattering and trying to move around. Some people had equipment that was breaking down in the cold. It was really entertaining to just see the problem solving to try and get that all fixed. And then when the thing launched, I was standing there with my friend Sean. He's a Canadian photojournalist here in Ottawa as well. And Sean said to me, hey, can you hold up this big cardboard piece? And I'm going to try and take a picture of the rocket going through the piece of cardboard. It had like a little Canadian symbol on it, just as your Canadian is going up into space. And so the Canadian's name was David Saint-Jacques. And despite everything, despite the cold, despite the snow, despite this abort happening beforehand, the launch was beautiful. And I was standing there holding this thing and just trying to be ultra, ultra still. And I have to say that I know that you Americans have these moments of pride, right? Where you're watching movies or you start looking at athletics. And I had one of those moments watching my Canadian going up there. It was the first time I'd ever seen a Canadian astronaut right in front of me go into space. And it just went beautifully. So I had a lot of respect for how they
Definitely.
that rocket in just a few months.
Can civilians go to the rocket launches?
Yes, they can actually. I wouldn't recommend Russia right now for a lot of reasons we don't need to get into. But I think some of your best bets actually might be the Kennedy Space Center because there were lots of beaches and places where you can stand on the shoreline and watch it go. So SpaceX sends something up there almost every week near the Kennedy
Wow.
Center. Yeah. So just watch the launch schedule. Understand it might change, but try and book like a solid, I mean, this is privilege of money, obviously, but if you can get a solid few weeks in Florida, you're probably going to see something, right? And then just pick a spot on the beach, bring lots of food, lots of water, stay comfortable, and then try and stay up to date with your updates. And fingers crossed it's going to go, right?
Yeah.
And then, but that's not the only spot. I mean, I know that there are many Americans around many states. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, there's a launch range not too far from there, so you can try out in that region. They usually go to the planets, which is kind of cool. You'll see like Mars missions and stuff there, and security missions for the US Space Force. Or another option too, if you're kind of northeast, is Wallops. And that's a really interesting area. It's very rural. It's going to be harder for you to get to, but if you can drive out to Virginia or even somewhere nearby the coast, you can see this thing go. And understand, I mean, you could be close enough to see the rocket and to feel the vibrations and all that, but you can also be maybe a few miles away and even just see the light of it,
Yeah.
which I think can also be really, really interesting, right? So there's a lot of different ways to experience a rocket launch.
Very cool. Is
Yeah.
there what's the relationship now between NASA and SpaceX?
SpaceX supplies all this stuff for NASA. It's a trusted partner. It's been doing so for, gosh, 12 years, 15 years now. So they do a couple of things. They send cargo to the International Space Station that's using their Cargo Dragon spacecraft. They send people to the International Space Station. That's with their Crew Dragon spacecraft. Same idea, but with crew and with more life support systems and stuff. And they also send up satellites, which is really important because we need satellites to communicate with each other. I mean, it's only because of satellite that I'm sitting up here in what usually is the frozen north, not in September perhaps, especially right now. But, you know, that's the only reason I'm able to talk to you. There's a satellite up there, you know, sending our stuff back and forth.
Which is
And
crazy to think about too.
yeah, this is not something that was around in the 1990s and the 2000s. And if I might just get off track really quickly, the movie Contact, where they were doing video calls, for those of you who are younger, that was not a thing back then. It was really weird. I was watching this going, how are people talking over video? I can barely do dial-up in my house. So anyway, so satellites for communications and also for Earth, because we want to see what's going on with all these storms and how to predict and how to keep populations safe. And so SpaceX provides a lot of infrastructure for NASA, both for its space station, but also for the rest of us, essentially, to keep us going. Yeah.
Is there other countries in their space programs? Do we work with them? Well, you know, what is that type of relationship with? Because I remember, like, if we think back to the Apollo missions, there's like the space race and which country was going to get there first. And it was almost like a competition.
It's so difficult to kind of put that into a few words because there are a lot of countries that are in space right now. I mean, back in the 1960s, there were the Americans and the Soviet Union, and that was basically the two big powers that everybody was clustering under. We did have other folks working in those programs that weren't American or Soviet. Like here in Canada, for example, we had this program, to go off track again, it was called the Avro Arrow. It was a super advanced fighter, and then it got expensive and our government got a little scared. And they said, you know what, we don't feel that it's good to be supporting this program for various expensive reasons, so we're just going to shut it down. All of a sudden, we had these highly qualified people out of work, and NASA said, hello, how about you come over here? And about a dozen of them, I think, or so, maybe 20, went down to NASA, and they helped build what became the Apollo program and Gemini and Mercury and all those. So anyway, they were clustering under those two, but now there's like half a dozen, 8 launching states at least, right?
I saw India has done some interesting
India
stuff,
just
right?
landed on the moon, right? Like who would have thought about that back in 1968? Right. So maybe the best way that I can explain it is we have these frameworks, and people tend to kind of cluster with the framework because it's sort of an easy pointer. So the International Space Station, there's a big one. We've got what, like 24, 26, something like that. A lot of countries that are working together on that and continuing to work on that, even with geopolitical difficulties. And then many of those people are now working on Artemis as well. A notable exception is Russia for obvious reasons, but it's committed to staying with the International Space Station at least until 2028. That was actually confirmed this morning.
Okay.
We're filming. So, you know, we know that they're in it for a while. So mostly it seems to work out pretty well for a couple of reasons. The first thing is I think that there's an understanding that in a remote environment such as space, you have to sort of look to each other as team members. Because the moment that you start to bring up all your differences, it becomes very dangerous. And I'm not just talking in a political sense, but in an environmental sense. Because if you're sitting there focusing on the other person's gender or nationality or how bad their breath smelled this morning or whatever, and then a problem happens, that distraction may end up being very bad, right? You need to focus on your mission and not on all the differences that are there. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm not a politician, nor am I an expert in space policy, but some folks think that these types of missions are good as a policy tool to get people used to working together on bigger projects, and then hopefully that leads to better things here on Earth. I don't know how effective that is, and I'm just saying that gently. I just don't know because I don't have that expertise, but that is one of the arguments that you sometimes see put forward. I do like to think the best of people, and
Yeah.
clearly, at the International Space Station, it's done really, really well with that. So I have a lot of hope going forward for that program and also for the moon.
With the International Space Station, it's been there for goodness, what, 25 years or something? Is,
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Since 1998 was when the first module went up.
dang, yeah, 25 years. Is
Yeah.
there what are some of the current missions they're working on now at the International Space Station?
They're trying to get people to stay up for longer, and they're trying to figure out what happens when you're floating around for 6 months or even a year. Because when you're doing that, you're putting a lot of strain on your body. And I
Mm-hmm.
realize it sounds super relaxing. I'm in a pool, I'm not doing anything, right? It actually is bad. If you ever saw the movie Wall-E and how everybody's just kind of looking like jello, in that movie, that's
Yep.
kind of how you're going to be feeling if you're not exercising and trying to get your strength going regularly. So the challenge is trying to keep people safe up there. And then what they do is they take those treatments and they pivot it to folks who have maybe muscle disorders or who are aging or who have osteoporosis or all these other conditions here on Earth. Even balance, it's another thing you could think about.
Yeah.
So that's what they're really trying to be working on because it helps all of us eventually with medical treatments. And then it also helps with that trip to Mars. Because think about it, you get on your spacecraft, you're floating and not exercising your body in the same way for 6 or 9 months. You get there, and then your space agency says, hello, time to build a habitat. And you're like, how? I can barely lift my head. How am I supposed to be
Yeah.
building this habitat? And so these are problems, as much as I'm joking, we need to know how to keep people safe and secure because if
Mm-hmm.
they can't build their habitat on Mars, there is no mission. They have to turn
Yep.
around. Yeah.
Didn't you helped write a book about that, right? Like
Yes, I
what
did.
happens to the body?
Yeah. It was a really fun book called Why Am I Taller? And it's because when an astronaut goes into space, or anybody goes into space for a length of time, their spine begins to lengthen because there's nothing pressing it down, which is really
Wow.
weird. So you do get a bit taller, and some people actually get a bit of backache, if you can believe
Mm.
that up there. And it was me and also a really, really capable real life space doctor, Dave Williams, who's run a couple space shuttle missions here for Canada.
Dang, very cool. What's one of the more interesting things you learned about what happens to the body in space?
I think one of the more interesting things is our eyes. We still know so little. I mean, I'm sitting here with glasses, so I clearly understand about at least
I have
minor eye,
contacts, so
right?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go, right? So many of us have differing levels of visual acuity. But here's the weird thing. Another Canadian astronaut, Bob Thirsk, he was up there in the late, sort of about 2009, 2010 period. I have to look it up. Anyway, so he's got this checklist in front of him. And he's just passed his medical on Earth. He's feeling pretty good, right? And so he's like, oh, yeah, I just read this checklist on Earth. It's going to be no problem. Wait a second. I can't read the font. What's going on, right? And so he calls down, as you should, right? And eventually they got some equipment up there and they began to take a look. And it was him and another crew member that were both having the same problem. And they noticed that something about the eye changes while you're up there. It's your shape, the shape of the eye very, very slightly begins to distort and makes it harder to focus and see what you're looking at. Now, why is still being investigated, if you can believe that. It's more than 10 years ago, right?
Wow.
But a lot of theories, there are some, but there's some about the floating. Maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe it could be the carbon dioxide concentration on the station. Maybe it's something to do with your genes that just gets triggered while you're up there. And so believe me, NASA is working very hard on this problem and they made a lot of progress. But I think that that's one of the more interesting things to look at, right? Because who would think your eyes
Mm-hmm.
would change so much while you're up there? And to be clear, many of these astronauts came back and they were fine,
I was going to say, was it permanent change?
It could be in some cases, but not all cases. And also, we're not talking, from normal vision to something that's very, very detrimental or very, very changed, might be the better word. So it's not like they saw a ginormous change, but it went from being able to read 8-point font really clearly to maybe a 10 or a 12. So you can understand that you would notice that and have some concern, like many of us
Excellent.
do as we age, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Is there in your idea, your thought, your prediction, do you believe we'll have civilizations on different planets?
Oh, yes, I do. But just don't ask me when. I have no idea. Again, the Mars mission is 20 years away. So I can sit here and go, oh, yeah, by 2043, we're good. We're on the red planet, we're ready. And then I'm an old woman, and there's no mission out there, and you're all going to laugh at me. So anyway,
I
I
do
think it's going
believe,
to happen. Yeah, but
just
not.
from um
Yeah.
my understanding of the Artemis missions, we are on the right track to do that.
Yes.
Because I like you said, like if I was 2000, and I was 13, 14 years old, I'd have been like, oh, we're good. Yeah, we'll be in Mars in 20 years. But now we're 20 years later, and I feel like we've just actually started a program that is going to put, hopefully, humans on Mars.
Exactly. And to be clear, there have been efforts. It wasn't like in 1972 when the last Apollo mission was on the moon. We just said, okay, that's it. Forget about the moon. We're never doing this again, right? Every so often, NASA or the president or somebody else would try and restart it, but you got to get some momentum behind it. It kind of has to be that right moment. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? You know how often when you're trying to go for a goal, you're just like, you know what, this summer, I got a lot of expenses. I just can't do it. So that's kind of the same problem, right? You're trying to shoot for this goal, this policy goal, but then other barriers keep coming up to make it happen. And so I think this time what changed was that more countries are available, right? And so that creates both collaboration and competition, depending on what side of the coin you're looking at. And another thing too is we have all these companies now. I mean, SpaceX was barely around in 2000
Mm-hmm.
when you got interested, right? And now they're a powerhouse. They do quite a lot of stuff. So we can actually outsource, just like some of the rich people do, right? But yeah, outsource some of your difficulties to these companies. And so NASA says, you know what, SpaceX, how about you do the lander? We're going to supervise, obviously, but as long as you got your technical stuff together and you keep going with that same excellent degree of care you have now, you're
Mm-hmm.
going to be fine. You're going to get our astronauts down, and then we don't have to pay for all of it, right? We give a little bit of funding, and then SpaceX uses that funding for its own missions in the future. So it's actually really cool. It's kind of like watching a company develop with that venture funding that you see at the beginning of their lifespan, right? And so the venture funding comes in, which is in this case kind of like government funding. It gets a system together, and then they can go and resell it and then generate benefits that you can't even imagine. And
Dang.
so all this wasn't possible, right, in 2000, but now that there's more independence and there's more countries participating, I think that made the cost more affordable and easier. Not easy, but easier.
With with you, let's say you like you're walking down the street and you're talking to somebody that you say, I work in the space industry, like what are the first kind of questions you normally get from people about space?
So the first thing I do is I clarify what I'm talking about because they might think I'm an astronomer or something. And so I say I write about space, and then I usually bring up planets and Elon Musk because those are things that most people can identify with, right? I treat folks with a lot of respect because they have expertise in fields I can't even imagine. I can't repair my car, okay? I have no idea how the car works. The car guy, I trust. We actually have a great guy around the corner. I really like him. So, when he's talking to me about the car, I'm doing a lot of research to catch up, believe me, but if he tells me something, I just have to kind of take that as my first step and then go from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to treat people with that same respect when it comes to space and to let them lead the way. And so when I come to them and say, hey, I write about planets and Elon Musk, then I wait to hear back to see what they want to talk about. Because sometimes it's about movies, and that's a whole other fun conversation, right? All the great movies and TV shows coming out lately. Sometimes it's about education. Sometimes it's about diversity and equity. Or sometimes they just want to know what's going on right now because it's not reported a lot in the mainstream media. I think still space, it's more than it used to be, but it's such a confusing and technical field that I can agree there's some intimidation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But luckily, there's also a lot of YouTubers and independent folks that are doing great reporting alongside the rest of us. And I think that makes for a really interesting community because you got a whole lot of different types of people participating.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm learning just as much from those folks as hopefully they're learning from us as well, right? As I'm sitting there alongside them.
There has been, I think, maybe you're right, maybe not on the mainstream media, but there has been a peak in interest, I feel like, in the last few years. And maybe it has to do with Elon Musk and SpaceX and some of these movies. Is there a movie outside of Apollo 13 that you love for around space?
The Martian is another big one. I was just joking with a friend about that on Twitter or X or whatever you're calling it the other day. Because, what I liked about The Martian is it made space really approachable. The whole thing is it's done with a light touch of humor while still illustrating a really serious situation. I'm trying not to spoil it too much for people. And I just found it an absolute joy to watch because basically the aspect, without getting into spoilers, is you have one problem and you solve it, and then another problem is going to come up, and you solve it, and then another problem comes up. And that works everywhere, right? It could be my broken down car, around the corner talking to my friend over there, or it could be Apollo 13, the space mission, or it could even be just trying to figure out how to get into school, if you're trying to get into college and you don't know where you're going to get the funding, and you don't know how you're going to go to the residence. You don't even know how you're going to get across the state because there's no college that's close to you. And so there's all of these problems you got to solve along the way. And with every one, you got to grow a little bit and then solve the next one and the next. So that again is one of my favorites. A little older, but still one that I really enjoy.
No, it's really good. Is there I read that you potentially one day would want to be an astronaut. Is that still an interest of yours?
Oh, 100%, yeah.
What's the process an individual needs to go through to become an astronaut?
Well, it depends on if you're paying for it or not, but okay, seriously. So the reason I said that is we have a lot more options now. We've got Virgin Galactic, we've got Blue Origin, and if you have even more money, you might consider Axiom Space, for example. Those are all companies that have sent people to space that usually pay for their seat. The starting price is somewhere around $400,000. And so appreciate it when I say that's a lot of money and that most of us don't have access to that money. But at the same time, there are organizations that step in and that fund, in many, many good circumstances, people to go up there. Virgin, for example, just was partnering with a company, an entity rather, called Space for Humanity, which brought up 2 folks from the Caribbean into space. They couldn't afford the tickets, right? But they allowed a couple of folks to go, to experience it, and then to go back and to interact with their communities. So that's the paying route. The non-paying route is usually going through some kind of a space agency, or a little bit more a private company, like being an astronaut instructor for Virgin Galactic or something. So if you're going for an agency, in NASA's case, they recruit about every 2 or 3 years. You generally have to be between about 25 and 50. It's sort of loose, but that's kind of the age range they usually hire folks. They want you to have an advanced degree in something. And if you're military, a lot of flying time too is really beneficial. Another thing too to think about is a lot of experience in remote environments. So let me give you an example. Christina Koch, K-O-C-H, but pronounced Cook. She's on the Artemis 2 mission. She's one of the NASA astronauts. She used to be an Antarctic scientist, okay? So you appreciate if you're working in Antarctica that things are going to break, you're going to be cold, you're going to be, probably in some degree miserable, but trying to take the best out of it, right? That's really good experience for climbing into a spacecraft, I would imagine, right? Like that'd be the person I would want with me, because when something breaks or when things get tough, she already has the resources for how to deal with that. Another good example is Laurel O'Hara, who is a NASA astronaut going up in September at this time. That might change, but anyway, she's going on a Soyuz spacecraft. Her whole job used to be working with marine submersibles. So in other words, like little vehicles that go in the water, like Alvin, Jason, like that series of things. And again, you're out in the field, your submarine refuses to go. What do? You can't just go over to Best Buy and get another transponder, right? You gotta get it working on site. So that's what they want. They want somebody who's used to working in a really difficult environment and solving problems in a small team. And so if you can demonstrate that, you've got a better chance. And then I guess the last thing is you're probably going to be rejected the first time and the second and the third. So you just keep applying. Most people start when they're in their 20s and they keep on going. And then, 8, 10, 12 astronaut selections later, maybe in their 40s, they'll get in there.
Yeah, persistence. You just got to keep on trying.
Exactly.
Is there what is, and it might not be the Artemis, something outside of the Artemis, what are some future projects you've maybe heard of or things that might be in the works?
For NASA or for other countries or both?
Because there's both, just for space travel.
There's a lot of stuff that's going on. It's actually very hard for me to keep track of it all. So I think that one thing to really watch for, let's start with India. So India, as many of you probably know, just became the latest country to land on the moon, which is no small feat. It's very, very difficult. A lot of other countries have tried recently, and it's hard. You can't. And
that was just a few days ago, right?
Yeah, it was not too long ago. They landed something, and then they had a rover, and the rover went out and it took pictures. It was great. And now, as we're recording, it's hibernating, and we're hoping it's going to wake up. But even if it doesn't wake up, huge success. They've met every single milestone they could imagine and more. So they want to send their people into space now on top of their own rockets and with their own spacecraft. And they have a lot of history they can point to because India has one of the best rocket programs in the world. They have been sending stuff up to space, satellites, payloads for decades. And now they clearly have interplanetary experience too to help them out, right? And so I really do believe that it will happen eventually, as long as they can continue with the funding path and do it with maybe some guidance from others. And then we have other programs happening too. I mean, look at China. It's got a big space station and a program that keeps on growing. They're sending all kinds of folks into space into there. And we also have Russia that is planning to restart its moon program. They didn't have success this time, but they're planning to try again and to do it in the future. Maybe even send people one day with China, which would be really interesting to watch. And then, of course, we've got other space agencies. Like I'll give one for Canada because I'm from Canada and I haven't been too patriotic yet. So I'll just do one. We have a little mini rover that is supposed to be going on the moon around 2026. And what really is fun about that for me is that we're a small community up here. Space is small overall, but in Canada, it's super, super small. And everybody who has ever touched lunar exploration, and especially craters, knows of the person who's leading the science. His name is Gordon Osinski, and he works for a really great place called Western University in London, Ontario, not UK, but Ontario. And he's going to be heading up the science, and it's going to land on the moon. And it's going to have instruments on board, and it's going to trundle around and do a little bit of science. And we're doing it on our own, right?
Nice.
We have some help from launching, but once we get there, that's going to be mostly Canada leading the way. And for a little country like mine, I mean, we're big geographically, but small in population. That's huge, to have a mission like that going on. So I can't wait to watch it go.
Yeah, you can be. Yeah, definitely. You got to take some pride in that. Is
Yeah.
there what do you think about aliens?
What about aliens? There's lots to say, of course.
Do you think there is life outside of humans on other planets already? Or had there have
pull
been?
out a contact line and say, yeah, there should be. Otherwise, it would be an awful waste of space. Be yelling away for a minute.
and I don't know if that's been some of the uptick in interest or media coverage, because I guess some more of that has been coming out, and I feel like I've seen more alien talk in a way, other spacecraft talk in a way,
Exactly.
pique people's interest.
It's interesting. So I'm not a military expert, but I'm watching with just as much interest as anybody else, because I both know that craft can be more capable than we can imagine, right? In terms of even what humans can build, but also it's fun to sort of think about other possibilities, right? And that's why I'm glad it's being talked about. I don't know how much can be released in the end because of security reasons, obviously, but we'll just have to keep seeing and wait for, more information to come out. But who knows, right? It's good to keep your mind open.
Yeah. And I didn't know, from somebody in the world that you live in this, NASA, SpaceX, writing media coverage, if it was talked about frequently.
It is talked about frequently, and it's been done more so recently because of all those hearings. And so you have to imagine that somebody like me, I get dozens of press releases a day in my inbox, right? But you can kind of see trends, right? And so for a while after Webb went up, the JWST telescope, there were a whole lot of things about that telescope. And then because the projects were smoothing out and there was less to talk about in the moment and more longer term, the press releases slowed down. They never stopped, but they slowed down. And then as something else comes up, such as these hearings, then all of a sudden you'll get a surge of interest and experts and commentary about aliens, right? And then that will go away and something else will take its place. It's just like everything else, right? I mean, I realize that, Taylor Swift and Barbie and some other topics, right? They come up in the news, down in the news. But it's just the way that a news cycle works. So I agree. It's something that I've seen more interest in lately, and we'll have to see how long it persists. But I'm glad that more questions are being asked about it.
Yeah, me too. It's fascinating. What do you have a favorite planet?
My favorite planet. I got a favorite moon. I would have to think that over. I mean, obviously Earth, I would guess, because I'm, living on it. But,
outside of Earth.
Yeah, I guess outside of Earth, yeah.
And you can answer moon. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's another moon out there. Like, it still blows my mind.
I'm just kind of quickly thinking through. It's hard for me to choose. It's like choosing a child, right? Because they're all really interesting. I like the idea of being able to stand on something, so I'd probably say Mars. It
Mhm.
seems like it's something I could actually picture myself being on. You can't really stand on the surface of Jupiter in the way that you stand on Mars, and so that's one place that interests me. I think one of my favorite moons or most intriguing moons is Europa. And I remember seeing those pictures from a long ago mission called Voyager that went by there. And it's still operating, by the way. It launched in the 1970s. I wasn't born yet, and it's still doing its thing way out there in space. But the point is, it swung by Jupiter, it swung by Europa, the moon that's nearby, and it took these pictures. And for years, I still have it somewhere, I think. I had this really cool image that was taken by Voyager of the crescent of Europa. And it looks just like our crescent moon, except there's ice on it, which is just
Dang.
really weird, right? And so I've been wondering for a long time what's under that ice.
Hmm.
Is it like the Europa report, like that movie, or is it something else? Who knows? And we're going to be sending out a mission real soon to start answering those questions. So NASA has a mission called Clipper, Europa Clipper. It's going to stay up in orbit. Again, that same problem where you can't see all the way down, but it's going to start to take measurements. And then maybe in the future, we can get a landing craft out there to kind of see what's next. So
Dang. It's,
yeah.
it's wild. With takes me back to the James Webb Telescope, and it recently sent back pictures of a supernova, right? One of the more famous supernovas. Can you
Yeah,
talk about what a supernova is?
totally. So it's a big thing. So we got the sun, right? It is. It's really fun to try and think about how to explain it. So
How
we got
big
the
it
sun.
is,
We can
yeah.
kind of understand just from looking at it, not directly, but you know what I mean. We have a sun, and it's a fairly large size, but stars that go supernova are even bigger. These are huge, huge stars. And so what happens is they burn out their fuel, and there's a cycle, right? You have hydrogen and you have helium, and you keep burning heavier and heavier stuff. But after a while, there's no more fuel left to burn. And so at that point, what you start to see is a bit of physics in process. And so, very simply put, the star begins to collapse on itself. And then it produces a spectacular explosion that we see as a supernova. And one of the more famous examples actually is something that left behind what we call the Crab Nebula. And so that was actually spotted and marked by Chinese astronomers back in the I think the 1050s when it went. And you can still see the remnants with telescopes like Hubble. And that just blows my mind, right? That was in not too long ago recorded human history, 1,000 years ago.
Dang.
Still see it changing and shifting. So yeah, that's a supernova.
That's incredible. What about as we're kind of wrapping up here?
Yeah.
You have to kind of, in my eyes, right? There's always like if somebody asks me about something that I'm interested in, I kind of have like a favorite stat or a favorite thing that like I'll tell people about it. Is there something that do you have something like that about space or what you
Yeah.
cover?
So the number of people who've gone to space is something like 600. It's a bit of a squishy number because there's debates about where space begins and what's an astronaut and all this stuff. But let's just start with 600
All
as
right.
our number, okay? So we're sitting here in the year 2023. That's all the way back since 1961. All right. So since 1961 to 2023, 60 some years, we've had 600 people ish. I wouldn't be surprised to see that number accelerate very quickly once we get these private missions going more often, because the
Mm-hmm.
Virgin Galactic is sending, 4 people up or 6 people up every month. And then Blue Origin comes back online. They've had to stop for a while because of an incident, but assuming they come back online soon, that's another 6 people going up maybe every month or every few weeks. And so all of a sudden, you're seeing people going up and down on really, really short missions. And if you count those in that big number of 600, you're going to start to see that start to click over really, really quick.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just so weird to me, right? Because there's what, 7 billion of us now? And 600 is just an infinitesimally small number
So
compared to 7
tiny.
billion, but it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's going to be more and more different types of people that are going as well, which I find even more inspiring than the number. Like knowing
Mm-hmm.
that those 2 folks went up from the Caribbean, for example, means so much to me. And then knowing also that we had people like Haley Arsenault, that astronaut on Inspiration 4 with SpaceX, flew with a prosthesis, which is amazing. It shows that we can have all types of people safely and greatly operating a spacecraft. And there she was up there. So yeah, I think that would be my number. The number of
Very
astronauts.
cool.
Yeah.
With your career going forward, I know you're right now you're doing a lot with the Artemis program and mission. Where can people find your work if they were, looking for articles or things that you were covering so they can kind of follow what you're covering?
So The difficult thing is social media is changing so quickly, but I do have a persistent website. And so you'll have my name in the show notes and everything. So you just take
Mhm.
all that, elizabethhowell.ca, and that's usually a good spot to start to find out where I am. Right now, I'm writing for space.com as their staff writer of Spaceflight, which is exactly what it sounds like. I'm talking about Artemis 2, which is one of my big things, being a Canadian with Canadian Jeremy Hansen on board. And I'm also all over many social media networks. So just keep looking for me. Maybe if I'm not on the preferred one, I'm on a different one. I've got like 5 or 6 now. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what we're doing with LinkedIn. Like we're all on LinkedIn, right? And it's good. You have good conversations, but I still sort of like, I'm not too sure what I'm doing out here.
Yep. And as you mentioned, I have your profile and everything for
Yeah.
people that you sent me to. So that'll all be listed in the show notes. But thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure having you on. Space, just like you said, a supernova, right? It's just like so big. It's almost just hard to wrap your brain around it, your mind around it. But I do believe there's a lot of cool stuff going on. And I'm excited to talk to people like you so you can help me better understand it. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm just really get inspired by the younger folks coming underneath me because they're just so smart and they're going to solve a lot of problems that I haven't even thought about yet. And so I'm hoping that if you enjoyed that show, just to keep getting curious and keep learning about this stuff, and then show me what you did in a few decades. I'll be watching.
And you might be an astronaut by then.
I sure hope so. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth.